Greetings everyone, and welcome back to our discussion of the Mega Man X series. If you haven't seen part 1, you really should go back and watch that one before we get underway here today, as it helps provide some background and context for what I'll be covering today. Link provided in the description below just in case. And if the first 3 games formed a trilogy largely focused on X himself, being a sort of X trilogy or arc, the 3 games we'll be covering today make up both the PlayStation trilogy as well as the Zero trilogy. I say this because the events of Mega Man X4 through X6 will focus much more on Zero, past, present, and future, though not necessarily in that order. Once more, I'm going to go in release date order and break it down, though this does require 2 trips through Mega Man X4, as you'll select whether you play as X or Zero for the duration of the story, and you can't swap between them once you've made this decision. Oh, and we'll be skipping the mechanical breakdown this time, as these games are the most mechanically similar of any of them, so just assume that more or less what I say goes. Really, the biggest innovation here is being able to duck in X5 and X6, and the advent of the cheat codes for Ultimate X and Black Zero. I'll get more into this in the character selection towards the end, but that said, let's start with the title character. X's story begins in the Sky Lagoon, a structure of dubious usefulness before it was sabotaged, but now a rapidly descending hunk of rock, ready to level whatever has the misfortune of being beneath it. After disposing of a gigantic mechanical dragon that was for some reason here, we run into a smaller mechanical dragon in the form of MegaDRAGOON, who is apparently a fellow Maverick hunter from the 14th unit. He informs X that the Maverick, I assume he means a giant dragon or one that only just made an escape, sabotaged the generator for the Sky Lagoon and advises that they both quickly flee. Resigned to the fact that there is nothing he can do, X departs to the crash site below with the city destroyed. There, X meets the Colonel of the Repliforce. His name is literally Colonel, and presumably so is his given rank, as we learn later on. Oh yeah, the Repliforce is a thing only mentioned somewhat tangentially, but the idea is it was an organization of Reploid production and R&D due to the failures of Sigma and Dr. Doppler in the last 3 games. They were actually supposed to aid in the Hunters' efforts to subdue Mavericks, but instead their number increased. Interestingly enough, in the manga adaptation of this same storyline, the Repliforce is actually an older organization, which drew increased criticism for not taking a more active role during the Sigma rebellions. The manga also enhances the Repliforce's cruelty and barbarism, having many of their number committing war crimes rather than relying on the moral ambiguity that ensued in the game proper. As X informs Colonel if the Repliforce failed to comply and returned to base immediately, their actions might be mistaken as Maverick behavior, regarded and treated as such, he warns. Colonel refuses on the grounds of his pride, his exact words, I'm not paraphrasing him. X knowingly growls that something has to give or things will only worsen. And worsen they do, as the very next thing we see is the Repliforce taking the legal Maverick status as poorly as X figured they would, and immediately declare their intention to secede from humankind and found a nation for Reploids only. The General, the highest rung on the ladder of the Repliforce's internal structure, confusingly says, and I quote, "This is neither about insurrection nor rebellion against our human creators," even though it is, in fact, a coup, which is, by definition, those very things. X is frustrated by this turn of events, and then is informed by the new recruit Double, a rotund yellow Reploid, that he is now tasked with dealing with this coup. Next, X faces off against the 8 Mavericks, and I'm going to analyze these in descending order of plot relevance. Most significant is his exchange with the traitor MegaDRAGOON. X repeatedly asks Dragoon why he betrayed the Hunters and let the Sky Lagoon fall, but Dragoon dodges the question, instead goading X into attacking him by claiming he not only did it without regret, but would do it again if given the chance. This infuriates X, who claims that Dragoon isn't himself, just the Maverick remains of what once was. X destroys Dragoon in their clash, and what remains of him afterward weakly explains to X that he had no greater desire than to fight X himself. Dragoon then explains in his dying breath a mysterious he instructed him to betray the Hunters in order to get his desired duel, and his final words were that the experience was worth it, even at the cost of his own life. Next, X goes to face off with Cyber Peacock, whose entire level is laid out like an obstacle course designed to test X's abilities to their utmost and analyze the resulting data. A stunned Peacock stammers, his potential is limitless, not possible. X chooses not to question what his target is talking about, asking him the all-important question of why, which Peacock disregards, only to find himself destroyed as well. After clearing out the 8 Mavericks in Repliforce's charge, X is challenged by Colonel, where X defeats him before pleading for them to call off the coup and cease further hostility. Colonel once more foolishly brushes X off, saying that the result wouldn't be the same the next time they met. Almost immediately after, this fated second encounter happens where X destroys Colonel for good and pursues the Repliforce's remains as they venture up into space aboard an armed space station. There, X learns that Double was, in fact, a double agent, who transforms into a combat mode and taunts X for what Double perceives as naivete. After X defeats him, Double mocks him further, saying the hunters made the job all too easy and that he was a spy from the start, sent to keep tabs on X's progress. In a moment of weakness, X says, "I trusted you," before Double explodes, laughing all the while. Finally, X meets with General, who claims that being labeled Maverick gave them no choice. X refers to the coup as mindless fighting, and insists there must have been a better way, but the Titanic Reploid isn't hearing of it. The two fight, resulting in General being defeated as well. In the wake of their battle, General tells X that the colony's weapon is activating because someone else activated it. X swears to stop whoever is responsible before going to the final fight. There, Sigma, clad in cloak and scythe as a visage of death, appears before his longtime enemy. Sigma joins the long line of enemies who taunt X, telling him that his plan to keep the Hunters and Repliforce at each other's throats in order to puppet things from behind the scenes was all too easy, and that Double did a magnificent job as a mole. X defeats Sigma again, as if I even need to say that at this point, and this time the villain has no big words other than he activated the weapon and would let it wreak havoc, his own destruction not even so much as slowing the process. X attempts to disable the weapon but is unable to do so, as the colossal General tells X he will use his own massive body to block the cannon and stop it from firing on the Earth. X tries to protest, but General cuts him off with his final words. "Many of my men have died. As their leader, I must join them. X, please forgive our foolishness." X's story is then brought to an end via animated cutscene as Zero raises him over the escape shuttle's comm system. X is hesitant and asks Zero what they'd do if he ever went Maverick. Zero seems surprised by the question but brushes it off, causing X to reiterate his point. If he ever went Maverick, it'd be Zero's job to take care of him. After a weighty pause, Zero replies, "Don't be ridiculous," and cuts the feed. X is then left to return to Earth with only his thoughts as company, and his story is punctuated by a narrator lamenting that it's all a mystery X would have to face someday. Meanwhile, Zero's story in X4 starts in a very different way, with Zero suffering a vivid nightmare, a flashback to who we fans know perfectly well as Dr. Wily, who claims that his rivalry is what gives him his motivation. He then sees images of Wily, Sigma, destroyed Reploids, and blood on his hands before jerking awake. That same dream, again, he sighs before deploying to the Sky Lagoon in pursuit of the Maverick signals. Zero is no luckier in stopping the fall of the impractical structure, and the city is leveled regardless of which hunter arrives. Down below, Zero finds Iris, a female Reploid and acquaintance of Zero's, and as it turns out, the sister of Colonel. Colonel arrives explaining he came to find Iris and is relieved to hear Zero had already saved her, Colonel even breathing a sigh of relief and telling Zero that he owes him one. However, Zero can't help but pry and asks if Repliforce is involved, which Colonel adamantly denies. Zero explains the misunderstanding, but once more, Colonel's pride gets the better of him, and they refuse to cooperate, leading to the Repliforce being labeled a Maverick organization. In the wake of General's speech announcing the coup, Iris chooses to join Zero at Hunter HQ, filling the role Double did for X, but generally pleading that Zero shouldn't battle Repliforce, all the while choosing to do nothing about him doing so. More on that later. Zero sorties to deal with the Mavericks much as X did, facing off DRAGOON to similar results, with the Maverick telling Zero that all he really wanted was a to-the-death battle against the Ace Hunter, and was promised his chance by Sigma if he cooperated. Next, Web Spider shows familiarity with Zero, calling to him by name and telling him that he leads a whole new unit within Repliforce. Zero even pleads with him to call the coup off and bring things down peacefully, but the arachnid Reploid refuses, resulting in his destruction. After defeating 4 of the Mavericks, Colonel challenges Zero to a duel, which is resolved via cutscene, where Iris begs the two to stop the match. Colonel relents, citing that he really did owe Zero for aiding Iris before and opts to walk away, for now at least. Zero remains deeply troubled, growling that someone has to stop Repliforce. When all 8 Mavericks are defeated, Zero must again challenge Colonel, this time in gameplay form. Zero attempts to barter his way out, citing that Iris would be sad to lose her brother, but he won't hear of it. Zero then proceeds to defeat him in similar fashion that X did before heading out to space. There, Iris stands opposite him with what remains of her brother, a power core it seems. Zero begs her not to, but she engages it anyway, becoming a ride armor-type Reploid and assaulting Zero head-on with a bombardment of explosives and lasers. Zero reluctantly defeats her, then rushes to her side in a cutscene that, really, really deserved to be dubbed way better than it actually got. It's pretty bad in both the English and Japanese versions. As Iris explains that she wanted a world just for Reploids where they would be safe, and more than that, together. Zero looks on in shock before desperately explaining that such a thing is just a fantasy, holding Iris close as her system shut down for the final time. Zero then goes on to face General, angrily pointing the blame in all the lost lives in General's decisions. The giant deflects them, claiming he has no regrets, and battles Zero, which ends in his defeat. Zero then has to rush ahead to square off with Sigma, but the villain has more than a new wardrobe awaiting him, as Sigma explains to Zero that the origins of the so-called Sigma virus lie with him, as Zero was the original virus carrier, who gave it to the then Maverick Hunter Sigma, igniting the Sigma Rebellion. Oddly enough, there's actually a flub in the dialogue here, with Sigma starting the story by telling Zero this fact before the cutscene, and then acting surprised and asking Zero if he was the Maverick afterward. Either way, Zero isn't bothered by it, even replying with, "What's your point? Are you that surprised?" Zero then defeats Sigma's 3 forms, with Sigma even throwing in the jab that Iris is waiting for you in the middle of it all. Once defeated, General again offers his life to stop the cannon from firing on the Earth. Before he does, he admits he was wrong, and that he let Sigma blind him to the truth. He signs off his conversation with Zero with, "It's all over for this soldier. Farewell." Zero escapes, and while heading to Earth, wrestles with his feelings, claiming he was powerless to save anyone, and then he wonders if all Reploids are just Mavericks after all. Whew, okay, we're done with X4 for the moment. From X5 going forward, we can complete the game in just one save file, and have the freedom to swap between whichever active hunter we had on duty on a per-level basis. And to think, when I started this miniseries, I was afraid this episode would be overly short. Anyway, X5 is a complicated beast because Keiji Inafune, the MegaMan guy, wanted this to be the last game in the franchise, so a lot of new things were attempted. For starters, there's a difficulty select under options and a dynamic scaling difficulty that doesn't realistically change your gameplay experience at all, except it gives bosses some more health, I guess. It's kind of dumb and only X5 and X6 utilized it. That notwithstanding, it became normal for shots to no longer travel through walls. X and Zero can duck, as said. The X started getting multiple sets of armors per game. In this case, if you choose to start the game with X, you'll actually keep his X4 armor, and can subsequently unlock the speed-based and terrible Falcon armor, or the heavily defended Gaia armor, which cannot physically make a vital jump in one of the in-game levels without modifications. If you begin with Zero, you get a pathetic pea-shooter gun, which is slow, weak, and useless, and nobody uses it anyway, so don't start the first level with Zero. Anyway, this game also introduces the cast of Maverick Hunter HQ. Aelia, the navigator who cannot shut up, Douglas, the mechanic who is here purely for plot reasons, Lifesaver, who is also here for plot reasons, and these two never show up again, by the way, and Cygnus, who acts as X and Zero's commanding officer. And lastly, the game is heavily influenced by a random number generator in a really, really terrible way, so let's talk about that first. The plot opens with Sigma spreading his virus as far as he can after a clash with X and Zero. This includes to a space colony, Eurasia, which begins to fall to the Earth, and the team is given 16 in-game hours to deal with it. However, this isn't measured in real time, just that 1 hour is subtracted each time you enter into a Maverick stage. The Hunters, using a weapon speculated to be the same one that Web Spider was guarding in X4, attempt to blow the colony out of the sky, but they're going to need parts to supplement it. Thus, you're encouraged to face the first 4 Mavericks, well, first. However, just because you get the weapon to 100% does not mean it will work, as this plot event is decided randomly. Once, as an experiment, I defeated a singular Maverick, fired the cannon, and completely destroyed the colony by chance, and opened the final levels of the game with 7 bosses left standing. Meanwhile, in my first run of the game, I faithfully defeated all 8, fired the cannon, which did nothing, leading to Plan B, which is use a space shuttle to kamikaze the end of the colony. Zero always opts to be the man in the rocket, claiming he's the only competent pilot who isn't currently infected, and will always man it. If this plan fails, you lose Zero for the rest of your run through the game. If it does work, you get to keep both hunters into the endgame segment. Guess which of these happened in my first run of the game? Yeah. See why I'm not a fan of RNG determining the plotline for you? Oh, speaking of, we're actually starting the game now. Woohoo! In the opening level, we play as X because we have common sense, and Aelia talks too much and we can't skip any of it. Whoops. After getting to the end of the stage, you rescue Zero, who claims his severed arm is nothing more than a bruised ego. The two contemplate that Sigma probably can't be analyzed like regular data can, but they can both feel that he is nearby. Upon destroying the giant Sigma head, the virus begins to spread worldwide. The hunters are frustrated by this turn of events and head home to report. We then are briefed on the condition of Eurasia and the 8 Mavericks we'll be dealing with. Fun bit of trivia, in the original PS1 release, the Mavericks of this game were given names that homage band members of Guns N' Roses, but subsequent re-releases, including the Legacy Collection, change it back to being more in line with the naming scheme that we've seen in the series so far. Now, X5 is a curious case in that there's multiple sets of dialogue that can be queued if the item is needed or not needed, and also if the boss of the level is actually corrupted by the Sigma virus. Thus, for this breakdown, I'm only going to highlight the dialogue and moments that are the most insightful to the characters. Crescent Grizzly, for Zero, has some pretty harsh words, in interesting contrast, as he mentions that X's presence is an honor. He accuses Zero of being Maverick already, but killing Sigma anyway, which Zero dismisses, either telling him he'll fight him anytime, anywhere, or telling Grizzly that his childish antics are growing tiresome. And first, for X, I found his encounter with Title Whale quite interesting, as he addresses X by the somewhat jokingly formal title, referring to him as Captain X and even seeming pleased to see him. After X explains the situation that they need ocean access for the Enigma cannon to fire, he even agrees with him. However, as a man of the sea, he can't back down from any challenge, which X reciprocates and accepts, almost as if it's an honor of his enemy. If you don't need the hydrogen from the ocean, Tidal Whale mournfully explains the ocean is dying, and that he would rather join in her fate. X silently accepts this rationale and the battle happens as normal. Upon meeting Volt Kraken, meanwhile, X even calls back to the very first game of the series, apologizing for having to destroy Launch Octopus. Kraken dismisses this out of hand, or tentacle, as case may be, and claims he quit being a hunter because he didn't like the messy work. Though rude and standoffish, X then witnesses Kraken succumb to the Maverick infection right before his eyes. If X didn't need the energy chip, he will instead lament how Kraken was already Maverick, and that it seems like he will always lose allies no matter how hard he tries, as Kraken gleefully threatens to kill X as revenge for Launch Octopus. If X encounters Spiral Pegasus when he no longer needs the item, Pegasus accuses X of killing General, which is equally interesting as he accuses Zero of killing Colonel, implying that bits and pieces of both storylines through X4 may very well be considered canon, rather than all one or the other. And lastly, Zero's encounter with the Maverick Spike Rosered indicates that Reploids have some sense, or maybe at least a belief, in an afterlife, as he will threaten Zero, saying when he dies he will meet the Reploids he retired again. The Mavericks defeated, it all comes down to whether Zero was infected with the virus or not. If he was, you'll be finishing the game with only X at your disposal. If not, you're free to select whichever hunter you prefer as you proceed. Either way, X and Zero will eventually cross paths, serving as a boss encounter for the other depending on your choice. Zero's AI, however, is very simplistic and a bit of a throwback to the optional boss encounter of X2. In fact, there's a hidden capsule on the self-same level, which will unlock either Ultimate X or Black Zero for you, so you should choose to seek it out. Even Dr. Light himself, or his hologram AI at least, admitting he's not exactly sure how he knows how to upgrade Zero's stats. Anyways, on to the boss fight. Lifesaver will be with either X or Zero upon arrival, and the former will jump to the conclusion that Zero must already be Maverick, having been exposed to the virus but seemingly no different at all. Zero protests and even X seems reluctant, thinking it could all be a misunderstanding. Regardless then, we see Sigma attempt to attack the two hunters, but the one you played as acting on behalf of the other before the final fight with Sigma, the only dialogue of note being Sigma referencing an old man to Zero, and then he will threaten the opposite hunter, then the one you triggered with the ending with. That sentence totally makes sense, I swear. Either way, someone ends up in pieces before being repaired under mysterious circumstances. The game comes to a close with X either suddenly not remembering Zero at all if Zero went Maverick, indicating that really was the end of the line for the Red Reploid, and possibly that timeline branch where MegaMan Zero might take place, or it can end with X becoming a more determined hunter wielding Zero's Z-Saber in order to protect others, positive that they'll meet again someday. Zero's ending is more ambiguous with him destroying Sigma, blown in half again and laying there, lamenting how sorry he was for having to destroy Iris. Either way, this game ends incredibly inconclusively. X6 picks up 3 weeks after the events of X5, with X having a recurring dream of Zero issuing him the order to pick up the good fight where he left it off. And not long after, a man named Isaac, I have no idea how you're supposed to pronounce this name, so I'm going with Isaac, explains that the world is suffering under the yoke of the Zero Nightmare phenomenon, which causes Reploids to see a strange vision, which Isaac claims is actually a nightmare, the sort of which will ultimately lead to the Reploid's untimely end. X is sent to investigate under Alia's instruction, only to find that the entire world is now a mess, and oh boy, let me try to explain this one as best I can. The game is plagued by a particular gimmick called the Nightmare Phenomenon, wherein certain levels might be highlighted in red. These stages get additional challenge aspects added to them. This wouldn't be so bad if these levels weren't so terribly designed in the first place. The game loves abusing instant death things like pits and spikes far more than any other X title, and relishes really awful gimmicks like Metal Shark Player's entire stage being one huge repetitious crusher trap. While things like the Shadow Armor help, you still have to unlock that, and giving the absolute spike immunity, while nice, comes off more as an obligation than a helpful suggestion, and made worse by the fact that the Shadow Armor, being the heavy armor, runs into the same problem as X5's Gaia Armor. You cannot actually clear an in-game level while wearing it without extensive modification. This is bad. This is really, really, really bad. But the game does introduce the concept of Reploid DNA, a concept that sounds simple when you first address it, but really snowballs into a mess if you think on it too hard, so guess which path I went down. Reploid DNA is apparently some combination of the Reploid's body mixed with their AI. The understanding appears to be the older the AI is, the more developed the personality behind it becomes. Therefore, the DNA of a Reploid is some mixture of their body type and their particular AI pattern. The Nightmare Souls found in the game are a permutation of this idea, made of corrupt Reploids on their most fundamental level. If this is all sounding just a bit heady, let me make a slightly different comparison. Consider it kind of like the dark corruption force often found in fantasy literature, and the idea is more or less the same. Just sci-fi. Anyway, like X5, you can beat this game very early on if you know how, and it isn't even RNG reliant this time. First, find the Nightmare Gate, and there's a very easy one to access in the latter half of Commander Yamark's level. Go into it and battle Nightmare Zero and finish him off using the Z-Saber. If it helps make it less unwieldy, you can cancel out of the Z-Saber's animation by dashing and vice versa, so rocking your thumb between the triangle and circle buttons will allow you to slash the sword rapidly. Once you beat Nightmare Zero, you retrieve the real Zero, and then you can go about defeating a Maverick boss, whereupon you can re-enter the same Nightmare world and battle Hymax and defeat him, which will immediately unlock access to the last levels of the game. And I advise you do it because frankly X6 is not worth playing. It's really bad. That aside, the Maverick dialogue is pretty brief and doesn't give me a great deal to work with, and this is already about twice as long as I planned this video as being, but let's skip ahead a little bit. It turns out Aelia was a research partner to a Reploid scientist named Gate, who kept trying to push the boundaries of Reploid and DNA research, to the point where the government made such practices forbidden. Gate was punished in some fashion, but it ultimately led to him being easy for Sigma to manipulate, because of course it's Sigma, and using the Reploid DNA knowledge to resurrect destroyed Reploids to become the 8 Nightmare investigators in this game. Isaac was just Gate's puppet, and he and Hymax shut down when Gate gets iced at the tail end of things. Like the game itself, Sigma's resurrection was rushed to market, and he's barely even coherent when you encounter him. He's literally so broken on a fundamental level that upon encountering X, all he remembers is hatred, screaming, "Just die, X," over and over again. And he's no better if the blonde Maverick Hunter finds him shouting "Zello" in appropriately Englishy fashion. Not that translation is X6's strong suit to start, but I digress. X's ending in this game hinge on whether or not you save Zero. In one ending, the Hunters are reunited and swear to work for peace. In the other, X and Aelia talk over Gate's fallen form, and X, for a brief fleeting moment, senses the presence of his absent friend. In Zero's ending, he willfully subjects himself to a sort of sleep chamber, which will purify his body of the virus and thus the logical segue into Mega Man Zero. And thus our analysis of the games come to a close for this session. So let's talk about the cast one more time. X himself stays very true to his essential character here. He's kind of a goody-goody, but that's what makes him the good hero. He constantly requests his enemies back down peacefully so that they aren't forced to destroy everything in sight. His enemies' reluctance to do so and their confusing his gentle and well-meaning nature for naivete is usually their own downfall. General himself begs X's forgiveness at the tail end of the story in X4. Several Mavericks in X5 respect and commend X for his actions. Ultimately, it seems his own gentle nature is the only thing standing between him and his own deep-seated concerns that he too might one day be a Maverick. Zero, meanwhile, gets a good deal more characterization this go-around. You learn a lot more about him, as he was the invention of Dr. Wily. You also learn that Reploids do, in fact, have romantic pursuit. How they pursue them is none of my business. I just think it's a little weird that Zero, who was literally blown in half on more than one occasion, is able to be repaired just fine, but Iris, who was completely intact upon death, could not. Just thinking out loud here. It's also speculated Zero is flat out immune to viruses due to having a sort of antibody to the Sigma virus, having once had and then lost the self-same. Zero's history, however, seems markedly more checkered than X's, as several of the bosses seem to have a beef with him. Be it Crescent Grizzly or Burn Dino Rex, it seems that he has a long-standing history of being somewhat of a hard case when it comes to enforcement. And Zero's attacks often being listed in the Japanese serve as yet another contrast between the two leads, Zero being a Wild East to X's Wild West, in addition to the contrast of their own innate weapon choices. And most of the Maverick Hunter support team don't get much character in these games, so they're going to wait for next time. So lastly, Sigma is just flat out insane. His efforts in X4 make him out to be a satanic parallel, whispering little dirty thoughts into the right ears in order to facilitate the Repliforce coup. In X5, he played something of a chess master, with every countermeasure the Hunters took just moving his agenda one step further to its fruition. In X6, he failed to get the Day 1 patch, and thus language and development and pseudo kind of hell in the bottom of a pit underneath Gates' lab. His methodology varies wildly by game, and his exact goal is not exactly clearly defined. We'll actually learn a good deal about his ambitions next time, vague though they may be. Okay, this went on for way longer than I thought, so let's stop here for now. Join me next time as we explore the last 3 main games of the series, X7, X Command Mission, and X8. There, we gain a new ally, and we have the worst down step in the entire franchise, followed by the biggest upward step. Join me there, won't you? And I'll see you there.
Iris! Iris! Ah! No, this isn't happening! There's no reason for me to go on. What am I fighting for?